So Hilda is a thing, or is still a thing. Hilda was actually the very first episode of This Is a Thing I ever did, and I actually wrote that episode in its first form all the way back in 2018 when the first season came out. I just sat down and wrote about how that show made me feel, and how it depicted child and parent relationships in a very different way from other shows. What can I say? I like to write essays for fun. But here we are, 4 years later, and Hilda and the Mountain King movie just came out, and all I can say is, man, does it feel good! For two reasons. I'm always stoked for more Hilda, so that feels good, but everything that I talked about in the first video about the relationship between Hilda and Joanna, and how strong the theme of understanding between parent and child is in that show, carried all the way through to the end. I was spot on, and man, that feels good. But since then, we've had a second season, and now a movie, and it's all been amazing. It really opened up more of the world of Trollberg, and the movie was a spectacular culmination of several of Hilda's overarching themes, and tied up some of the most interesting conflicts and mysteries of the series in a meaningful way, which felt really good, and I don't just mean because I was right, and I was right, but also because this climax and culmination felt really satisfying, because this is probably the end of the show. Do you hear that? That is the sound of my heart breaking! But I suppose I shouldn't complain too much. If this is indeed the end of Hilda, then 2 seasons in a movie is pretty good. Better than a lot of other shows.
Show's gonna last 3 weeks! 6 seasons in a movie!
But the movie really is a great conclusion to an epic fantasy adventure filled with lore and magic. Trollberg appears to be a regular city, but it never feels boring, because it's actually filled with creatures like the Nissa, elves, witches, and of course the titular trolls. But what really sets Hilda apart is the way the show handles its conflicts, which is especially unique for a children's adventure show. A lot of children's shows like to set up a great adventure or conflict, but then end up having the message be we should all be friends, and that's important, but Hilda doesn't really do that in the same way. Hilda doesn't talk down to its intended audience, and as a result, the show had a much broader appeal. And that is because Hilda is ultimately a show about relationships and empathy. But unlike most children's shows, Hilda presents its empathy through the narrative action, theming, meta-narrative presentation, the depiction of power structures, the concept of the other, and a realistic approach to conflict resolution. Not only are the show and movie a great way to teach empathy, but it makes that teaching process fun, and that makes it kind of even more amazing and meaningful. And so today, I want to talk about Hilda. Again. In case you just came from the first video I did, I'll make this short. The TV show is an adaptation of the graphic novel series created by Luke Pearson. Sometimes called Hilda Folk after the first book, it follows the adventures of a young girl named Hilda as she explores a world filled to the brim with characters inspired by Scandinavian folklore. Luke Pearson had previously worked on Adventure Time, but had never given much thought to making his graphic novels into an animated show. But when a producer at Silvergate Animations in London sent Pearson a proposal, he found their approach charming and filled with a love for the story, and so he began a relationship with them. In 2016, it was picked up by Netflix, and production on the series began. The show kept Pearson's color palette and unique art style, but changed some other elements, like exploring the characters of Frida and David in order to make sure Hilda had consistent friends throughout the show. Pearson was also conscious of making sure the show had a progression to it, and that each episode was different so as to avoid the formulaic narratives that children's shows often find themselves falling into. The show is packed to the rafters with interesting human characters and the previously mentioned fantastical creatures of Scandinavian lore, all living side by side, sometimes in conscious harmony and other times in ways shrouded in mystery. The show was praised for its adventurous themes and superior storytelling, and garnered a shit ton of awards to its name after only the first season, and more with each subsequent release. I'm only going to go over the larger details of the first and second season, but I'm out and out going to spoil all of the movie, so fair warning. In the first season, Hilda starts out living in a cabin in the countryside with her mother and adorable pet deer fox, Twig. When they begin to receive threatening messages telling them to leave and never return, Hilda sets out to find out who is threatening them. What she discovers is that their house was built right next to a village of tiny elves that are invisible unless the appropriate paperwork is signed.
You really need to sign the paperwork.
In the process of trying to get the elves to leave her family alone, Hilda stumbles upon a giant waiting for his lover. With the help of an elf named Alfred, Hilda helps these two giants reunite. But the giants are so big they don't even notice when they step on Hilda's house, and Hilda realizes that this is how the elves see her and her mother. So Hilda, Twig, and her mother move to Trollberg, where Hilda meets David and Frida, and she explores the city and naturally gets into as much fantastical trouble as one precocious little girl can. In Season 2, Hilda and her mother don't see eye to eye, as Joanna often feels Hilda puts herself in danger without asking or thinking about how she might be injured. Throughout her various magical adventures, Hilda and all her friends discover witches, talk to krakens, fight zombie Vikings, and much more. All the while, the number of trolls outside the city walls is steadily growing, and the inept and annoying leader of the city safety patrol, Eric Alberg, mostly attempts and fails to make himself look good in an attempt to do something about them. Eventually, Hilda and Joanna make up after leaving a forest filled with trolls and happily return home to Trollberg. But the next morning, Hilda wakes up to find that she has become a troll, and her mother finds a little troll girl turn human in Hilda's place. The movie sees Hilda try to get back to her mother by making a deal with a giant troll trapped under the mountain. Meanwhile, Joanna searches for Hilda in the forest while David and Frida try to find a magical way to turn Hilda back. While Hilda helps the giant troll, she also discovers how trolls live and what makes them happy.
Car parts.
Barrels, buckets, and pine cones.
Plants! What do you collect?
Soft furnishings.
And that there's something that calls to them from inside of Trollberg. Many of the trolls are very angry at the humans for always ringing their loud and painful bells and think that they should attack Trollberg, but others just want to be left alone and live in peace. Meanwhile, the safety patrol is making huge moves to protect the city from troll attack and starts spreading false information about the trolls. When Hilda and the little troll are reunited with their respective mothers, they change back into their proper selves, but Hilda finds out that the troll she had been helping is actually the Mountain King who wants to destroy Trollberg, and he begins marching towards the city. Hilda tries to stop the safety patrol from attacking the trolls, because the thing that calls them to the city is their mother, who fell asleep for many years and woke up to find that people had started living on top of her, and she didn't want to hurt the people. But as the city grew, the trolls were forced further and further away from their mother, and the Mountain King knew that if the trolls were in danger, their mother would move and crush the city. So he provoked the safety patrol into attacking him. Luckily, Hilda shows compassion for the trolls and saves the city, and every year the trolls are allowed to come into the city to be with their mother. People building a wall and weaponizing bells to keep trolls out should ring with familiarity, because we have seen this kind of behavior fairly recently in the real world, but it is a narrative that has played out many times in human history and in fiction. It's also not particularly novel for a children's show to take on themes of this nature using imagery that is analogous to the real world. But the difference is that empathy isn't used as a kind of repair all problems deus ex machina solve all issues solution that swoops in at the last second to justify the good guys not having to incarcerate or kill their antagonists so everyone can be friends. In Hilda, empathy is presented as part of the action and is more often than not part of the breakdown of the episode. In the first 2 episodes, Hilda doesn't want to leave her home, but when the giants flatten her house without even noticing, Hilda's placed into the same situation as the elves and understands the feeling she was putting them through. Hilda did not start out as unempathetic towards the elves, and even spends the majority of the first 2 episodes seeking a way to work with them through their exasperatingly bureaucratic system. In the beginning, this comes from a defensive place, as Hilda does not think she is doing anything wrong by living there peacefully with her mom, until she is forced into a similar position as the elves. And this, of course, is very much the definition of empathy, the ability to understand someone's point of view and situation. After experiencing the same or similar events to the elves, Hilda's outlook changes. It's not as though Hilda was not sympathetic beforehand. We can see when she pulls the bell off the troll's nose that she wants to help others and feels for them, but in that exact moment when her house was crushed by people who are preoccupied with their own shit, Hilda is truly able to empathize. This point in the show is so important because it's both the thesis of the show's major theme and the impetus for why Hilda moves to Trollberg, which sets most of the story in motion. From then on, anytime Hilda comes into conflict with another person or group, her primary motivation is usually to figure out who they are and what they want and how she can help them in order to stop more people from getting hurt. There is still conflict in the show, and the show's writing is top-notch to be sure, but what is unique is that the call to adventure in most episodes stems not from the need for a hero to defend or vanquish, but because Hilda wants to find a way to understand or work with the creatures and the people that are struggling.
What would Hilda do?
She'd probably go and ask a troll.
Hilda's want for understanding is what drives her to seek adventure. This is amazing. Because of this awesome writing, we have a show that has its main character wield a sword and fight crazy creatures, but have the driving force of that adventure be empathy. Through the entirety of the show, we constantly come back to empathy, and it's often pitted against, or at least shown to be in contradiction, with bureaucracy. In the beginning, it's the elves' bureaucratic system that stops Hilda from achieving her goal, but it's also an obstacle for the elves themselves, as all the rules keep them from being seen or engaging with people in a way that might actually be more productive for them.
I'm afraid to say that fixing the situation at this point is,
Out of your hands?
yes.
When Hilda, Frida, and David make friends with Kaisa, the witch/librarian, they're trying to get these old witches to show compassion instead of upholding rules.
Cast immediately into the void of no return.
Oh, come on. We don't do that kind of thing anymore.
Every fucking time the safety patrol is on screen, they are so frustrating because of their rules and the fact that they are incapable or don't want to change their perspective about the trolls. It's also worth noting that most of the conflicts dealing with empathy often have to do with natural forces and nature, and understanding why these spirits or creatures feel the way they do. Hilda has some strong environmentalist themes, and I'm down to clown with that. In the real world, nature and creatures don't speak like in the show, but empathy towards animals and nature is possibly more important than other humans because these entities are incapable of defending themselves in the same way that humans can. Watching and being entertained is a big part of why people watch television, and I already talked about the moment of Hilda's empathy in the first 2 episodes with the elves, and as I said, this moment of realization is done visually. This speaks to Hilda's entertainment factor, but also to the way it conveys empathy to its audience. This means that the audience is left to watch Hilda as she puts the pieces together herself. At that same moment, we the audience are left to put those pieces together for ourselves. It makes the viewer work it out on their own and come to their own conclusions about empathy. These scenes are also intercut and mixed with Hilda's own reactions, and this teaches empathy to its viewers by allowing them to draw their own conclusions about putting themselves in Hilda's place as she puts herself in the elves' place. In the movie, the feeling of wanting a mother's love is what draws the trolls to the city, and this is the same thing that drives Hilda to make a deal with the Mountain King. This turns out to be a stupid choice, but Hilda is desperate to get back to her mother and makes decisions without any knowledge of who she's dealing with. This desperation explains Hilda's poor choices, and this is the same kind of desperation and fear that drives the humans and trolls to not understand one another. None of this is stated out loud or explained, but through the use of its expressive and beautiful visuals, the show knows its audience is capable of drawing conclusions based on the information given narratively and visually, because children are very capable of learning empathy. But empathy also has to do with the understanding of something that isn't one's self, and Hilda has some very interesting things to say about the other and the exertion of power by institutions. This dude named Jacques Derrida was part of a group of predominantly French people called the post-structuralists. He liked to argue that the way we view the world was all out of whack, and like his peers, he was preoccupied with power structures and knowledge. In Hilda, the people of Trollberg are a fully established city, and they have organized systems and structures that have made the trolls out to be villains. The trolls are shown to have the ability to organize, and have done so in the past.
Mountain King.
He was the only one that ever managed to unite any real number of us around a single idea, to lead an army of trolls to attack the city.
But they're far more disorganized in terms of traditional societal structures.
No troll has tried to crown themselves king or queen since.
Maybe you don't need a leader then.
This is important because I don't think it's hard to see that the people of Trollberg see themselves as the more advanced and established of the two groups. This is what Derrida calls a hegemony, and the fact that the humans displaced the trolls and claimed the land was theirs is a classic hegemonic power move.
Why did they build a city in the middle of Troll Country anyway?
Why not? The trolls weren't doing anything special with the land.
This larger societal and cultural power subsumes, subjugates, and possibly antagonizes people of a lesser position. The people in Trollberg have a system of bells for defensive purposes, and they have created weapons to stop and defeat the trolls. As the trolls' numbers begin to grow, the safety patrol begins to send out propaganda about the trolls in order to push their mindset on more people. This in particular is a great example of exerting power through the control of knowledge. That's right, Hilda is about hegemonic power structures. And you thought this was a children's show. Well, it is actually, because the subplot between David and his parents being on opposite sides of the conflict is also about the lack of power that children feel in hegemony.
This is ridiculous. Everyone we've turned to either can't help, or won't let us help.
Flipping grown-ups.
But in the end, it's actually the kids that make the difference in breaking down the divide between the two groups. But what does this have to do with empathy? Despite the fact that the trolls do seem to have some kind of intelligence, the people of Trollberg choose to see them as this kind of monster. When one group separates itself from another group, they create what Derrida calls the other. And how people view the other can be problematic and can even be used to control how people think. When learning about the other, the knowledge about and therefore the power over the other is reduced, and this means there's a loss of control. When people are scared, they feel the need for control in order to make order out of the unknown. Individually, people may not be interested in learning about the trolls because this changes their worldview into something that is unknown and scary. The unknown is the other. On top of that, systems of power such as the Safety Patrol may not be interested in helping people learn about the other because it reduces their power and prominence. Eric Alberg is a good example because as long as the trolls are a threat, he can make himself look better and get more cool weapons for the Safety Patrol. He seems pretty incompetent anyway, but he may not actually want to see how trolls might not be bloodthirsty man-eaters because that would change his position of authority in the public's perception.
Trolls might not be afraid of bells, but they are deeply annoyed by them. It's a surefire way to rile them up.
Ultimately, Hilda comes to understand that the Eye of the Mountain King shows people what the trolls want, and when she throws the eye at Alberg, he sees the troll's mom from their perspective. This is the same kind of experience that Hilda had in the first 2 episodes of the show. Because of this shift in understanding, in knowledge, and therefore a reduction in power over the trolls, Alberg is able to empathize with them and stops attacking. The trolls just want to feel the love of their parent, and this is something that everyone can empathize with. But once again, this show takes a different approach because not everyone is friends. At the end, when the trolls are allowed in the city, the show explicitly says that not every resident of Trollberg was happy with this. This is a reality. Some people do not want to change perspectives for many reasons: control, fear, power. But the show always frames empathy as a thing we should strive towards, and it's always a strong motivation to subvert conflict and power structures, which leads the characters through adversity. This literally makes empathy not just the outcome of the story, but the driving force behind the adventure. Not only does Hilda learn empathy, but she passes it on to others in a fantastical way, and all the while we get to watch a wicked fantasy story. In the midst of this wonderful fantasy adventure are the workings of some fantastic writing and visual storytelling that are able to convey information about empathy, knowledge, and power structures regarding perception and understanding. Hilda is a show that treats its intended audience of children with much more maturity than others of its kind. There isn't a formula that repeats the same morality play about empathy episode after episode, nor does it re-articulate these themes at the end of every episode. Instead, these themes are conveyed and built upon in each episode, and the story structure shows how characters learn and internalize the values of empathy towards each other, nature, their peers, teachers, and whatever the fuck woofs are. I don't think the show expects its viewers to pick up on how hegemonies control knowledge for the purposes of power, but I do think that the show is a great example of how people act when they create the other and propagate a negative perception of those people. It also presents the world as flawed, even when the best outcome occurs, because that's sometimes how the real world is, but it's still a satisfying ending to a conflict and a show. And that is why Hilda is the best way to teach empathy, and why I needed to talk about it again. Here are my stray thoughts. I really enjoy how characters are set up or teased in episodes beforehand and sometimes even seasons ahead, and they stick around for a long time rather than just one episode. Kaisa is my favorite character with the exception of Twig, because he is still the cutest and the Deer Fox episode was heartbreaking. Please, 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 please just give us one more season and then I'll be happy. Actually, the Mountain King was a pretty good conclusion to the story, but that doesn't mean I have to be happy with only 2 seasons in a movie. Come on, put yourself in my shoes. Your adorable little boots. Hey! Thanks so much for watching that episode. If you enjoy Hilda and its opening, you should check out this fan-made video called Zelda that's done in the same style as Hilda, but with all characters from the Legend of Zelda video game series. It's really cool and really well done. Be sure to check out our other channel, the Cinemasters, for more conversations about movies. Don't forget to like to help the channel grow, and subscribe so you'll never miss another episode of This Is a Thing, the long and the short of it, and anything else that's happening right here on Cinemasters Ultimate Timeline.